This diary is a technical diary. She protocols every day at the Bauhaus who is visiting, whom are we meeting, what is the subject of the meeting. You can use it as a calendar, as an agenda to not be wrong in what happened in such and such month of such and such year. I am Jana Revedin, a German architect and researcher.
My name is Anja Guttenberger, and this is my podcast, Bauhaus Faces. Welcome to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces. Today's episode of Bauhaus Faces is not about a typical Bauhäusler, not a student or a master. She nevertheless played a crucial part in documenting the history of the Bauhaus between 1923 and 1928 in her diary. And of course, she was also Walter Gropius' closest confidant, advisor and editor, his wife Ise Gropius. Ilse Frank was raised in Hannover and worked as a Red Cross nurse during World War I. She moved to Munich in 1922 to work at a publishing house. When her mother was dying, Ilse returned to Hannover in 1923. Here, she met Walter Gropius at one of his lectures about the Bauhaus. They started to write letters to each other and quickly became affectionate. She wrote to him, "Up to now, my whole life I felt as if I have been pushing a very heavy boat over a gravel path. And the minute I met you, my big boat suddenly glided into water." She had been wanting to meet a person like him, although at first she was much more interested in his Bauhaus idea than in the man himself. That came with getting to know him better. So she broke off the engagement to her cousin, moved to Weimar, and only a few months after knowing Walter Gropius, they got married. From the very start, their relationship was a symbiotic one, also shown in their nicknames. While Walter Gropius was known at the Bauhaus as Pius, derivated from Gropius, Ise was often called Pia, the female version of Pius. Ise Gropius entered the service of the Bauhaus as a secretary, editor, organizer and equal partner for Gropius. Soon she became Mrs. Bauhaus, and she liked her role very much. "The Bauhaus infected me," she would later say. Her transformation from a long-haired young woman into a Bauhaus woman seems to complete by 1926 when the new Bauhaus building in Dessau opened. Now, Ise Gropius wore her hair much shorter and her clothes were of the latest fashion. In that sense, Ise represented a modern way of living that the Bauhaus propagated. Ise Gropius' biography has not been researched extensively like that of Walter Gropius, of course. In the end, she was a woman of her time, always the important drive behind her husband. So there's no monograph about her, is what I'm saying. Nevertheless, did Ise Gropius attribute to the history of the Bauhaus by documenting its every step between 1923, when she came to the Bauhaus in Weimar, until 1928, when Walter Gropius and her left the Bauhaus for good. In that sense, Ise Gropius is the first chronist of the Bauhaus, meticulously documenting in an agenda what happened on what day, who visited the Bauhaus, and which guest professors held lectures at the Bauhaus, and of course which parties took place. And although Walter Gropius in one letter to his wife Ise states that he thinks that her diary lacks the subjective female view, we seldomly get a glimpse into the psyche of Ise Gropius and into her personal life. It's also here in her diary that she reveals that she played more roles than just being the wife of the Bauhaus director. The endless times that she said phrasing lectures and articles for her husband. And she also reveals that she was the designer of the kitchen at the Gropius house in Dessau. When she reaches out into the world to start a career of her own as a journalist, she quickly realized that this part of the world too is dominated by males. This short excursion into a professional life of her own soon ends when the Gropiuses decide to leave Germany for good. For this episode, I asked the architect and author Jana Revedin to help me tell the story of Ise Gropius. She wrote a biographical novel called Jeder hier nennt mich Frau Bauhaus, Everyone Here Calls Me Mrs. Bauhaus, which was published in 2018. The novel is based on Ise Gropius as a main character. So let's dive into a new episode of Bauhaus Faces and shine a light on Ise Gropius.
She was brought up as typical for the enlightened and liberal families of that time in very good schools. She even had one exchange year in Great Britain, so her English was fluent. Even listening to her interviews then given in Harvard, she could really speak without any error, any grammatical or pronunciation error, which made her the ideal, of course, ambassador for the Bauhaus. Remember that a Paul Klee or a Mies van der Rohe would not speak one word out of their German dialect. So she really was the open-minded and very, very well-trained young woman of a liberal family. Her father would say, "You can please go and study." She wanted to study Germanistics and philosophy, but she was disappointed after the first year how theoretical, how away from the real life of persons this study was. So then she saw in the newspaper an announcement of, "Come to our publishing company and our bookshop. We look for people." It was after the First World War. Of course, it was difficult to find well-trained and still alive people in Germany. So she applied and she was taken. And this was her career made by her own. She was very, very well received in this publishing company in München. She had to change the city. She had to change even the dialect because Bavarian dialect was far away from the high German she would speak in Hannover, and she was trained. So it was a new life situation. She had a fiancé that was her cousin, but knowing then Walter Gropius, it is very clear for her that this new dimension and this life mission that this man inspired in her would be more important than herself and more important than build a little, let us say, bourgeois reality. So she decided to leave to Weimar and to marry this man after only 6 months that they had met. And in fact, Walter Gropius, who very much appreciates her, he would always say she is exactly at the same level and importance as I am, which is for his time. He came also from the last century, a very, very courageous and very, very liberal statement. His colleagues, who were even elder than himself were very hesitating on this new entry of Ise, coming with her verve and coming with her languages and coming with her idea to say, we have to publish, we have to make known this Bauhaus idea. If not, we turn around in circles here in the countryside there, what Weimar was at that time. But Walter Gropius defends her and places her, and a very important, I think, entry to the Bauhaus in nearly the same moment is László Moholy-Nagy, who comes from Hungary with the wonderful wife he has, who's another publisher, had worked in a publishing company, Lucia Moholy. And this couple, which has much more international views and openness, they will much support Ise in her standing in this a little bit still old-fashioned men's club, which is the teaching circle. But even Walter Gropius in 1923, when she installed herself and they had married, he has to state that at that moment, we are in the new century, but we men still have a problem to accept talented women. She was, on one side, the soul of this movement, because her idea as coming from a very well-educated and, of course, well-situated family, she said, we have to bring this family, the Bauhaus family, together also outside their teaching hours or their pedagogic activities. So her idea was not only to invite the teachers, local critiques, but also international critiques, writers, theorists, and pedagogues to her house. The Bauhaus family could have been also very closed in their inner circle. Her interest was to mix up these inner circle with outside views, critical views, but also, of course, supportive views. So those lunches and dinners at the house of Ise and Walter Gropius became a tradition. So she installed to write about the experiences of the Bauhaus. She could write. She was a very good writer.
Ise Gropius' main task at the Bauhaus and later in Berlin, Great Britain and the USA was to write letters and edit essays, lectures and articles by Walter Gropius. She adapted the texts to the respective commissions on the basis of jointly written texts. In Berlin, Ise Gropius also began publishing in her own name. Inspired by traveling into her own interests, she wrote a small number of articles that she sold to publishers. As a journalist, Ise Gropius demonstrated a keen eye for detail and a deep understanding of contemporary cultural and architectural trends. Through her journalistic endeavors, Ise was able to articulate the vision of the Bauhaus movement in accessible language, making the avant-garde ideas of the time more relatable and comprehensible to the public. She co-authored several texts with her husband, Walter Gropius. Her collaborations included writing essays, editing manuscripts, and organizing publications that showcased the groundbreaking work of the Bauhaus school. One of Ise Gropius's most notable achievements as an author was her work on the exhibition catalogue for the 1938 Bauhaus exhibition at the MoMA in New York with the title Bauhaus, 1919 to 1928, notably the time when Walter Gropius was a director at the Bauhaus. Ise helped compile and edit the book and was visibly granted as co-author for her editorial work for the first time. In addition to her collaborative works, Ise Gropius wrote about her own experiences and reflections, offering personal insights into the life and her impressions of adventurous trips. There's an article called Im Land der singenden Frösche und himmelblauen Wasserfälle, in English that's In the Land of the Singing Frogs and Sky-Blue Waterfalls, a travelogue about her impressions of the landscape and the people that she encountered on a journey to Arizona in 1928. Or another article called Wie sieht die New Yorkerin aus? What does the New York girl look like? Which was published in the illustrated newspaper Die Dame in 1928 and describes the various beauties of American metropolitan women. Both articles are published in German and English along with 3 other articles, Anxiety About America, What is Relax, and Driving in New York in the catalogue Walter Gropius' American Journey 1928. After going to London from 1934 to 37 and finally emigrating to the USA, her brief success came to a rapid end. After she offered the article Grandma Was a Career Girl to the Atlantic Monthly, she was turned down. This was done on the grounds that they did not want to support or even favor the, quote, horrible idea of working women that Ise Gropius discussed in her article and, as the author also represented herself. She decided to leave it at that and from then on concentrated on editing Walter Gropius's texts. As a consolation, Walter Gropius started dedicating his books to her to acknowledge Ise's part in it. Ise Gropius kept a diary that dates from 1923 and starts with meeting Walter Gropius in Hannover for the first time until 1928 when the Gropiuses decide to leave the Bauhaus and relocate to Berlin. It also contains letters that she and Walter wrote to each other over the years and letters that Ise wrote to Walter's mother, Manon Gropius. Later in her life, she edited her diary, added information and crossed others out. In whole, it is a 230 pages thick typescript that is today part of the Walter Gropius estate at the Bauhaus Archive Berlin. It hasn't been published so far. As the wife of Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus School, Ise Gropius's writings provide a unique perspective on the inner workings of this influential movement and its key figures. Ise Gropius was not just a passive observer, she was actively involved in the intellectual and social life of the Bauhaus. Her perspective as a woman in a predominantly male-dominated field adds another layer of depth to her accounts, highlighting the gender dynamics of the time and her own resilience and adaptability. But we also get, from now and then in her diary, a glimpse into her private world, into her thoughts, into her personal happiness and struggles. In her diary, Ise processes a miscarriage and subsequent complications that she suffered from. She would never be able to have children on her own with Walter Gropius. In compiled letters, she writes to Walter about doctor's appointments, operations, and her hopelessness. This is the only time when we get a glimpse at how she must have suffered from this. He comforts her and assures her his love and appreciation, calling her his partner of equal rank. In the last years of her life, her longtime helper, Nevin Summers, taped 2 interviews with Ise Gropius about her and Walter Gropius' life in Germany, England, and America. It is oral history and the continuation of a Bauhaus diary. It was published in 1986 with the title Small but Perfect Things. In its foreword, James Marston Fitch describes Ise as in intellect as clear and candid as a bell, diamond sharp in all its essentials, uncluttered by the details of a long and not untroubled life. Ise's Bauhaus diary and these taped memories from the end of her life do not only tell the story of a life full of creativity, friendships and change, but are also an invaluable resource for historians, offering a nuanced and intimate portrayal of the Bauhaus movement and its enduring legacy. But they also paint a picture of the history of 3 countries in 6 decades.
This diary is a technical diary. She protocols every day at the Bauhaus who is visiting, whom are we meeting, what is the subject of the meeting. You can use it as a calendar, as an agenda to not be wrong in what happened in such and such months of such and such year. Gropius was incapable to write one article because he could talk about 1 hour about one idea and lose himself in 1,000 details. It was Ilse Frank to make him sit down on the table and say, "What do you really want to say, Walter? Tell me 3 lines." And then she developed the article, or she developed the speeches that he had to held around all Germany and Switzerland and, of course, Vienna. So first she was creating an inner circle that was really lively and that was really open-minded, instead of closing down in a species of a gilde that would have been narrow-minded and coming from the past. She was writing down what Walter Gropius was defending. And as we see that the possibility comes up to build the new school in Dessau by the generous support of Junkers, the metal industrial that has settled down his industry in Dessau, there is the moment that she really can design together with Walter not only the buildings and the content and the programmation of the Bauhaus functions, but also this idea to settle the professors and the masters and teachers in one residential complex where they were forced to meet each other, to talk to each other, to exchange their ideas, and where the possibility was given that the students could live together with their professors in a very eye-to-eye dialogue and exchange, and not in the Beaux-Arts system of top-down teaching. We know what we know, and you have to follow our model. So she wanted to create, for the first time, a house that was designed respecting the needs of the human body's movement, of the 5 senses that we have. And Walter Gropius said, we built 5 boxes for the 5 master teachers, and then we leave everyone to do the interior design as they wish. In fact, for example, Kandinsky lived in his furniture that was of dark chain wood, like in the 19th century. So every teacher was allowed to create the inner spaces, the interior spaces as he preferred. Many of them said, it's much too transparent, too much glass. People can watch what we do from the outside, from the road and from the pinewood forest. They were absolutely hesitating to feel well in those transparent, democratic houses. But Ise made it her rebel statement, and it was much more even going further than being an ergonomic house. She wanted to create the house for the emancipated woman. And their house, the Gropius house, was the only house of the 5 residential buildings that the Bauhaus could build, thanks to the help of Junkers and of the city of Dessau, that was a working machine. It was designed that the kitchen would not be without natural light. Every movement in the kitchen and the dining room was designed in a way that it was flexible, because Ise said, every gesture that I'm rationalizing as a housewife, I can invest into my personal career, my personal professional work. And this was the message that she gave with this little Gropius house. And it was, we cannot imagine today which sensation this made. The whole German press was visiting this house, and she was explaining how much time she would share not standing and doing his useless ways from the kitchen to the laundry and to the dining room and back to the terrace, because everything was planned to be rationalized in the minimum of time. The follow-up of this ergonomic house was, of course, Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky with her Frankfurt kitchen that was developed then with Ernst May. And that became the world famous Frankfurter Küche, the kitchen of Frankfurt. That is the predecessor of every kind of ready-made kitchen, Einbauküche, that we have then all over the world after World War II. This was also always her mission to say, we don't even only have to produce new ways of design and new products of design. Think about the beautiful glass lamp. Think about the beautiful tea services that are developed and invented in the Bauhaus. We don't only have to produce and to show this to the market. We have to publish it. We have to make it known to the world. So, consequent idea of hers was, we have to do a little film about this ergonomic house. So she is a main actress together with her sister, who is by profession an actress. And they move inside this house and show us in black and white, of course. And it's a film still shown at the Bauhaus Museum today, how this home is adapted to the inhabitants' needs. It is also very flexible. The lamp that is illuminating the table then is turned to the other side, is illuminating the area where you would read or study. So it is a place which was the model of the idea that a living space has to adapt to the living beings and not other way around.
It is in her diary that we find information about Ise Gropius' involvement in the interior design of the Gropius house. For November 1926, just shortly before the Bauhaus building opens in December of 1926, she inserted the following entry in her diary. From July to October, I was so busy decorating our new house that I had to give up making entries in my diary. Discussions with my husband and the various workshops about the choice of colors inside and out, about the furniture that we need to buy, as we sold everything to start from scratch. An endless search for items for the kitchen, which I had spent a long time designing myself, as modern kitchens didn't yet exist in Germany. There was almost nothing on the normal market that would have satisfied both our modern technical and aesthetic requirements. At this time, on my husband's advice, I began to look for purely technical and scientific production facilities, which often satisfied us more than goods made especially for the household. And she also writes in her diary that the other Bauhaus wives, they also had their very own wishes, and that this led to big complications with Gropius, of course, because there was just a certain budget to be spent and so many special wishes of the wives. Like so many other women of her time, only in her later days, Ise Gropius felt the need to mention her successes. Designing the kitchen of the master's house is obviously one of them. And playing a role in the film about her house was of course something she did herself too. Along with her sister, the actress Ilse Frank, and another unidentified woman and her housemate, the Gropius house is shown inside out. The film with the title Neues Wohnen, Haus Gropius, New Housing, the Gropius House, is one of 4 films produced by Humboldt Film GmbH in 1926. Originally, there were 9 films that could be mixed together like modules. An idea that Walter Gropius must have liked a lot, as he was a great advocate of the modular system in his architecture, and the master's houses themselves were built in this modular system. The films show the dire housing situation of people in the 1920s, living in dark, damp and small flats that made them sick. Then, on the other hand, new housing estates of the Neue Frankfurt and of the Bauhaus are shown as harsh contrasts and as a sign into the right direction of 20th century housing. Natural light, clear lines, modular systems, technical devices for hygiene, and functional furnishing will improve the well-being of the people, is what these films are saying. In the 13-minute-long film about the Gropius house, the housemaid first demonstrates all the advantages of the new kitchen designed by Ise Gropius. Short ways, elaborate cupboards, a separate dishwashing kitchen between the kitchen and the dining room with a pass-through for the dirty dishes. All this is shown in every detail for a long 7 minutes. After that, Ise and the other two women, all of them looking dapper with their short hair and fashionable clothes, show to each other new technical features, like floor sockets, water cookers and movable lamps, and practical Bauhaus products like the light tubular steer armchair by Marcel Breuer that Ise moves around easily and up and down, a convertible sofa, the Gropius' double desk, and much more. The film about this house is like an actual advertisement for the Bauhaus and its design. And if you're curious now and want to watch the film on your own, I will of course put a link for you into the show notes. However, that acting career was just for this film. Ise Gropius' main task at the Bauhaus and later in Berlin, Great Britain and the USA was to write letters and edit scientific essays, lectures and articles by Walter Gropius. She adapted the texts to the respective commissions on the basis of jointly written texts. So, right after leaving the Bauhaus at the end of March 1928, the Gropiuses went on a journey to the US, invited by the contractor Adolf Sommerfeld and his wife Renée. Gropius had realized for them a house with the help of the early Weimar Bauhaus. It is a simple wooden expressionist house and looks very different to what we associate today with Walter Gropius's architecture: flat roof, white walls, glass facades and tubular steel furniture. The Gropiuses moved to Berlin in 1928 and traveled extensively during the early 1930s throughout Europe. In Berlin, Ise Gropius also began publishing in her own name. Inspired by traveling and her own interests, she wrote a small number of articles that she sold to publishers. These included Weltreise am Grammophon, World Trip on the Gramophone, that was published in the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, the DAZ, at the end of 1934, Engländer zu Hause, English People at Home, published in Bayers für alle in 1933-34, Die Gebrauchswohnung, The Functional Flat, published in October of 1929, Hausfrau Dackel und andere Weltbürger, Housewife Dachshund and Other World Citizen, also in DAZ in April of 1934, and Wie sieht die New Yorkerin aus? What does the New York woman look like? In Die Dame in November 1928, just shortly after coming back from her journey to America with Walter Gropius. If you want to read some of these articles, you can find them in the German-English catalogue Walter Gropius' American Journey 1928 that I have produced and edited for the Bauhaus Archive in Berlin in 2008. After going to London from 1934 to 37 and finally emigrating to the USA, her brief success came to a rapid end. After she offered the article "Grandma was a career girl" to the Atlantic Monthly, she was turned down. This was done on the grounds that they did not want to support or even favor the, quote, horrible idea of working women that Ise Gropius discussed in her article and, as the author also represented herself. She decided to leave it at that and from then on concentrated on editing Walter Gropius's texts. As a consolation, Walter Gropius started dedicating his books to her to acknowledge Ise's part in it. It was only in the 1938 exhibition catalogue titled Bauhaus 1919 to 1928, which was published to accompany the Bauhaus exhibition at the MoMA in New York, that Ise Gropius was named as editor together with Walter Gropius and Herbert Bayer, thus achieving public recognition for her work. In 1934, they settled in London in Lawn Road Flats, a building complex also known as the Isokon Flats, where some of the Bauhaus émigrés, the Gropiuses, Marcel Breuer, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, found a place to live for some time. The building was designed by the Canadian engineer Wells Coates for Molly and Jack Pritchard. Together they had founded the Isokon Furniture Company in 1929. At Isokon they created modern furniture made of wood. In 1935, Walter Gropius became the controller of design. Moholy-Nagy designed advertisement materials for the company when he arrived in Britain, and Marcel Breuer later replaced Gropius in 1936. When Ise Gropius' sister Hertha died in 1936, Ise and Walter Gropius adopted their niece Beate, lovingly called Artie. 1 year later, they moved to the US, where Walter Gropius started to work as professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University. But let's get back to Jana Revedin now, talk about Ise and Walter Gropius' emigration to the US.
So she did organize the escape to the United States and to the Harvard, recently founded Harvard School of Architecture. And by the way, Hudnut, the new young director coming from New York, he had visited the Bauhaus 3 or 4 years before, practically on his knees, and then came back to Ise Gropius writing, could I help you in some way? Could I get you a post in my teaching stuff? And of course he said, we take it right away. So it was a full-time job to organize a possible future for her husband. He was, anyway, the former director and founder of the Bauhaus. So he was the strong card in this couple to play. And when Hudnut then manages to get the post for him, it was not easy in this context, as I already described, which was not forward thinking in his Ivy League American colleagues context. Then he writes a very beautiful telegram when they are already on the boat crossing over to New York. And he said, we welcome you in the United States, where happiness and security await you. He knows that if they maybe did not escape, we are in 1937, everyone who was left over in Central Europe was in life danger.
Artie did only agree to move to the US on 3 conditions: that her bedroom will have a sand floor, she will have a free view of the stars, and a separate entrance to her room. While the sand floor was not negotiable, Artie would get a rooftop terrace above her own room and a spiral staircase made of steel leading up to it in their new home. The house itself was financed by an old lady who desperately wanted to see what modern architecture actually looked like. She wasn't necessarily convinced that it would look good, but she was curious enough to give them $20,000 to build it. Ise Gropius offered tours of the Gropius house in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Architects and students came to learn from the revolutionary Bauhaus. On the website of the Gropius house by Historic New England, you can still watch a tour of the house narrated by Ise Gropius herself. It was made in 1970, and of course I will link it for you in the show notes. This house became a 3-dimensional business card for students, clients, and colleagues. It also included the Gropius' wardrobe, the kitchen utensils, the furniture, and their art collection, very much like their master's house in Breslau did. Artie Gropius remembered, "In our house, aesthetics were always a primary consideration. Every nook and cranny always had to be on display and picture perfect." After Walter Gropius' death, Ise would run the house like a museum, and in 1977 arranged to donate the house that she lovingly called her small but perfect thing to Historic New England, a non-profit that still owns and preserves the house today. In 1944, the Gropiuses became American citizens. Ise experimented with photography and making jewelry with materials that she would buy at the local hardware store, similar to Annie Alvers. In 1954, they would go on a world trip to Australia, Japan, the Middle East, and Europe. After Walter Gropius died in 1969, Ise Gropius became a spokesperson for the Bauhaus and the modern movement, and an archivist of her husband's extensive work. Let's listen again to Jana Revedin. I wanted to know which sources she used in her research about Ise Gropius.
Oh, there is a vast, of course, archive in Berlin, the Bauhaus archive, that gave us up to a certain point information, because in the end, the Bauhaus diary of Ilse Frank that is still laying in Berlin in the archive was never published or elaborated. So that was, let us say, a basic information. We had to get much further in the research of our sources. We went directly to the United States, to Harvard School of Architecture, where the couple went to exile and luckily found a new employment for Walter Gropius when they had to leave Germany as Adolf Hitler took over power. So the Harvard archive and all kind of memories, still human testimonies who are still alive over there and who had lived together with the Gropius couple in their new house, the new Gropius house near Harvard School of Architecture. They were much more important resources and sources. And then, of course, I also researched in the familiar context of Ise Frank. And fortunately, she still has one alive niece, Evelyn, who by casualty lives very close to my place here in Venice. And this was, of course, the major personal information about how this woman made her life besides a very important figure like Walter Gropius. How did she live? How was she educated? How did she talk? How did she dress? How could you imagine this figure that, of course, is not documented in the Bauhaus archive, as she was not part of the teaching staff? I didn't choose her. She came up to me. I had a contract with the Dumont publisher in Cologne, and they asked me to discover some new personalities in the Bauhaus movement that we were not yet knowing much about. And I discovered, after Alma Mahler, the first wife of Walter Gropius, who was not at all included in the Bauhaus theory or teaching, I discovered this second wife that appears in Weimar and then afterwards in Dessau. And her name was Ise Frank. And this was a figure that I proposed to the publisher. And of course, they said that would be very, very refreshing to have not only a figure that is not an architect or designer. Well, Ise Frank was a writer and journalist, but in much more important, even that she is a woman who played this important role. Of course, the publisher would make a contract about an essay, a scientific essay that I was used to write as an architecture theorist and professor. But in a certain moment, I had to get back to the publisher saying, I need to write a biographic novel. It's a new format for me, but I like to dare it, because if I don't write a novel, in the end, I don't get close to the people and to the characters as I wish to get. And this was a risk that I was taking at that moment. In German, I called it's a citation of what Ise Frank writes when she first goes to a promotion tour to get fresh money for the new founded Bauhaus to Cologne. She writes back to Walter Gropius, here in Cologne, it's the Western Germany on the Rhine, the most open-minded Germany, a lot of industry, the closeness to France, to Belgium, to Holland. And she writes, everyone here calls me Frau Bauhaus. Jeder hier nennt mich Frau Bauhaus. She was surprised that she was taken as the testimonial of this movement, even not being part of the teaching staff and not being an architect. So it's the subtitle is Das Leben der Ise Frank, the life of Ise Frank. It was translated into languages where this citation was, let's say, skipped, and it's just called Frau Bauhaus or Madame Bauhaus or La Signora Bauhaus, which of course is a beautiful title. She never expected to be seen as the Miss Bauhaus or Mrs. Bauhaus, but she accepted it. And she said, if I have this chance to be close to this man that I love and that I, of course, want to support, I overtake this mission. It became the mission of her life.
Both Gropiuses, Ise and Walter, were part of this experimental movement, the Bauhaus, and they knew exactly how to promote Walter Gropius's idea of an art school, an idea Ise had fallen in love with even before she fell in love with Walter Gropius. She wanted to be part of this chapter. She must have felt how important the Bauhaus would once become, and was one of the loudest advocates of the Bauhaus during its existence and later on in the US. Even after his death, Ise would still promote the life work of Walter, the Bauhaus, and the idea behind it. Maybe Ise's small steps into journalism were not a whole career. In the end, Ise was a woman of her time, expected to back up her husband and make his career flourish, and that's what she did. While other Bauhaus women broke out of this patriarchal system, she did not. The diary she kept at the Bauhaus and her several interviews she did when Walter Gropius had died will, however, forever make it possible to better understand the Bauhaus, the people who lived there and who worked there, and its time. Jana Revedin's novel, Jeder hier nennt mich Frau Bauhaus, is an insight into what this life may have looked like in reality, backed up by historical facts from her diary. This diary is also the red thread that runs through the whole book. However, it's fictional. Please remember that in case you want to read it. It's not a biography about Ise Gropius. Well, we have now come to an end of today's episode. I hope you liked it. And before I say goodbye, I would like to ask you to help me make this podcast a little bigger and reach more listeners. Tell your friends, family, and colleagues about it. It is the only way that the work I put into my podcast episodes, which I do in my free time and with my own money, pays off. You can follow me on Instagram at Bauhaus Faces Podcast or send a link of a particular episode or of the whole show via Spotify or Apple Podcasts to your friends and family. If you would like to receive my newsletter that informs you every month once a new episode is launched, please write to me to bauhausfaces@gmail.com. That's Bauhaus Faces in one word. Or write a direct message on Instagram. And only by rating Bauhaus Faces on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, the show will move up in the ranking and will be shown to even more people. I appreciate all of you. Thanks for listening. And now there's nothing left to say but tune in to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces.